You know that the spyware is really bad when even the United States' federal spy agency is warning people about it. So there's been these announcements coming out, first from the FBI and then the NSA, and all the rest of the alphabet people have signed off on the warning, as you can see here, about vulnerable routers being exploited by state-sponsored hacking groups. Now, in the past, I've talked about how routers are one of the most exploitable devices in the household because of how poorly they're typically administered. Most people don't ever bother to update their routers or even log into them other than the first time that they set up their Wi-Fi networks. And honestly, I'm convinced that a lot of people don't even really bother to do that. Like, I remember when a new ISP came to town and they were going door to door selling the service to people, and a lot of people signed up for it because they were cheaper and the service was faster than some of the other competitors that were in the neighborhood. And then a little while after they were going on their sales campaign, I was walking around and you can see the different SSIDs in the neighborhood when you walk by with a smartphone or something like that. And I noticed that most people still had the default network names and probably also the same passwords that their routers came with. And just like any other device, there's vulnerabilities that get discovered in the router's software and firmware over time, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited if they go unpatched, as they often do. For example, if you have a TP-Link router that hasn't been updated in over a year, you might be vulnerable to this attack against the local web administration panel. This is the web page that comes up whenever you type in your router's local IP address into your browser, and it's the place where you would perform those administrative tasks that I mentioned earlier. So this vulnerability in particular is in the HTTPD service that listens on port 80 by default, and a hacker can send a specially crafted GET request to that router's HTTPD service, which allows the attacker to bypass authentication and read the router's internal password file in order to get those administrative credentials. After successful exploitation, the hacker is essentially your network administrator now. And luckily, this vulnerability is not remotely exploitable in most cases unless you have the remote console option enabled, which it isn't by default. The remote console option is what allows you to administer your router from a remote location. Typically, you only see it in office routers, and it's not turned on by default in most home consumer routers. So in those cases where the remote console isn't enabled, the hackers need to first attack the router over the LAN, which they would most likely do by first compromising one of the devices that are already on your network, like a phone or a laptop. But keep in mind that it's not just your devices that you have to worry about. You might have ironclad OPSEC when it comes to updating your phones and your laptops and tablets, but anyone else who has a compromised device that you've given your Wi-Fi password to could end up being a carrier of the malware. And when they visit your house or any other place that has free Wi-Fi for that matter, the attackers could then run an automated script that executes the exploit in order to get your router's credentials, and they could even turn on that remote administration feature in order to give them semi-persistent access to your router. Now, the reason I say semi-persistent is because the malicious code itself usually only runs in RAM, which gets cleared when you reboot your device. The same concept applies to a lot of smartphone malware, which is the reason why the NSA has given people the advice to reboot their routers. So if the malware is just in RAM, then it would end up getting wiped out when you reboot, but that might not be the solution to all of your problems if you end up being a victim of this attack. Because the main goal is not just to install a backdoor into your router, it's to make changes to the router to how it functions that would end up persisting after a reboot. You see, by changing the DHCP settings on the router, the hackers are able to hijack the DNS traffic of all of the devices that are running on the network. And the reason that DNS hijacking is such a nasty trick is because the attacker doesn't need to hack every single laptop, phone, and smart TV and game console on your network one by one. They can just poison that part of the network, the DHCP service, that tells those devices where the websites live via the DNS setting. So the downstream devices automatically inherit the attacker-controlled DNS resolvers, and then for specific targets that the hackers actually want to gather information on, they can then return fraudulent DNS answers that can set up man-in-the-middle attacks to steal passwords, tokens, emails, and your browsing data. So how do you protect yourself from this stuff in the real world? Well, first, you want to log into your router and actually audit it. You want to actually be the administrator of your router, just like you would on a computer, because, well, that's what it is at the end of the day. You want to check the firmware version. You want to check whether the device is still getting security updates. You want to check whether remote management is enabled and disable it if you don't need it. In fact, if you didn't enable that, that could be a clear sign of compromise because, like I said, remote administration is usually disabled by default on these consumer routers. And you want to check what DNS servers are configured under the WAN or DHCP settings, and you should also change the administrator password immediately if it's weak, reused, still set to the default, or if you think you've been compromised in any way. Now, the recommendation that the feds are giving for older devices is to simply replace them with newer ones, which is easier said than done because, for one, you'll probably end up spending about $100 or more on a new consumer router, and the FCC is also banning new foreign-made consumer routers from the United States market, and pretty much all routers are manufactured outside of the United States besides the newer generation Starlink routers. And when you think about that, it almost seems like Elon was the one who bribed the FCC in order to push his routers on people. Because again, these are one of the only companies that are manufacturing their routers here in the United States. But luckily, there is another solution for you. If you are satisfied with the functionality of your old router, I mean, if it's working fine, if you've got whole home coverage and, network speeds are fast enough, but you just aren't getting firmware updates anymore because it's an end-of-life device, you might be able to install open source firmware like ddwirt or OpenWirt, which could breathe new life into your old network equipment. Or if you have an older desktop PC, you might be able to set up a DIY router with pfSense, and you might have to install a new network interface card onto that device if you don't have enough Ethernet ports. But at the end of the day, you would end up having a much more powerful router firewall than anything that you would find in a Walmart or a Best Buy without spending as much money on a brand new device. And the networking and administrative knowledge that you would gain in the process is worth a whole lot more than what you would spend to convert that desktop into a router or what you would spend on buying a brand new router, because if you can set up your own router successfully, you're going to learn a lot about network security in the process. The main thing to keep in mind is just keep your network equipment up to date, and if you get a warning in your browser about bad certificates, don't just ignore it, because that could honestly be one of the final warnings you get before sending sensitive data through hacker-controlled infrastructure. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it to hack the algorithm, and check out my online store, based.win, where you can buy my awesome merch or accessories for your phone or laptop. 10% store-wide discount when you pay with Monero XMR at checkout. Have a great rest of your day.